Good evening, folks. Welcome to our Bible class. Wednesdays do come around rather frequently, don't they? Some lady said the problem with life is it's just too daily. Well, we are on a weekly schedule, and it's time for another class for us. We've had some difficult weather for the last few days. Fortunately, this afternoon the sun came out, and we're hopeful that maybe we're on the better side of all of that and that we'll see in the coming days an improvement all the way around. Tonight we're looking at Genesis chapter 23, and we're going to talk about the death of Sarah. We've reached a rather climactic point in this study of Abraham and his family. The death of Sarah is important on a good many different levels. She is the first woman whose death is recorded in the Bible. We know that others had died, but she's the first one who's actually recorded. And in the search for her burial place, which takes up a good part of our lesson, we have the first account of the search for a grave in the Bible. That's kind of necessary in a world where people die, but it's a new thing for us. Sarah's death sets in motion a good many actions that have not been previously considered in our study of the Scriptures. A grieving husband must cope with the same necessities related to death that countless others will deal with over the centuries. The poet Emily Dickinson says in one of her little poems, "The bustle in a house the morning after death is solemnest of industries enacted upon earth." She employs words we do not normally associate with death. Bustle, industries, enacted. Those seem not particularly poetical, and they don't seem related to the idea of death. But the first word that she uses, the word bustle, the bustle in a house, sounds almost irreverent. But the time of death is a time when one must be busy. There are things to rush about and take care of. The word industry speaks of detachment, maybe even lack of feelings. We somehow withdraw from it all to take care of necessities. And then the word enacted. That's a formal word. We move like actors on the stage, going through motions that seem almost prescribed to us. There are things that have to be done. That initial grief after the death of a loved one is a very personal grief, and we deal with it in our own personal ways. We saw that grief experienced by Jairus and his wife in the death of their daughter. We saw it in the reaction of that widow in Nain over the death of her son. And we've been thinking about it lately in our Sunday morning lessons in the lives of Martha and Mary and Lazarus and even Jesus. Grief is very personal. But even in the time of great grief, somebody has to step aside and curb that grief, but for a while, in order to handle some details. Calls have to be made, contacts have to be made, arrangements have to be made. Fortunately, there are professionals who are available to help us in all of this, and we have to give them our attention. Abraham had a major decision to make. Where do I bury Sarah? That decision could not long be postponed. It had to be handled. And so we have our text tonight from Genesis 23, and we're going to begin by looking at the first 6 verses where Abraham decides he needs a burial place and he knows where to look for it. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. So Sarah died in Kirjath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Then Abraham stood up from before his dead and spoke to the sons of Heth, saying, I'm a foreigner and a visitor among you. Give me property for a burial place among you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. And the sons of Heth answered Abraham, saying to him, Hear us, my lord. You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our burial places. None of us will withhold from you his burial place, that you may bury your dead. You might notice that expression, bury your dead, is going to run through here like a refrain. But what brings about the circumstances? Abraham and Sarah are well-to-do people, have been for a long time, but they owned no land. They were nomads. They moved from place to place as the mood struck them, but they never got around to being encumbered with any kind of property. Now, Abraham needed property. He needed a piece of land that was permanently his, where the body of Sarah could rest undisturbed. In our own culture, we seek a time where we want to settle down, belong to a place, and there establish an opportunity to bury our own dead. In spite of all that, there are a good many people who never quite prepare for that burial place until the need arises, and then it's a shocking discovery. Shirley's dad bought 12 burial plots in the late 1940s or early 1950s, and over the years, a number of those spaces were used, first by her parents, then by an uncle and aunt and several other relatives. 2 of those 12 are still unused. They're available if needed. Similarly, my father bought 6 plots in 1932 when his first wife died. There she was buried, along later with my grandparents and again other relatives. Those places now are all used. In the 1960s, we bought 2 burial places for Shirley and me. I can't get her to go over to Woodlawn to see our purchase. She seems utterly unimpressed with my wisdom and judgment in making such available for our future need. Oh well, we'll wait and see. As Abraham began his search, he began with a time to mourn and weep for Sarah, just as it should be. They had been married for a long time. Burton Kaufman speculates maybe as long as 100 years. After all, she was 127 when she died. It was a long marriage, far more than any of us could expect. But because loss is always painful, we need time to grieve. The facts surrounding Sarah's death are so specific: her age at 127, the place where she died, Hebron, with its original name, but later changed to Kirjath Arba, but it's always Hebron in the Bible. Those facts remind us of reading a modern obituary notice. We get in all the details to be sure we cover it for those who are wanting to learn about her. When we read about Abraham mourning and weeping, we need to remember that grief in that culture, in his culture, was always expressed bodily. Falling on one's face, wailing, beating one's breast, weeping uncontrollably. Nowadays, we think we try to be a little more dignified than all that, but it's a personal matter. Grief is still experienced, and it is still expressed in a personal way. But finally, in Abraham's case, practicality took over, and Abraham stood up, meaning he's been on his face before the body of Sarah, but now something has to be done. His bodily posture changes, his attitude changes, his reality takes over. Where will I bury Sarah? He went to the sons of Heth. Those were later known in the Bible as the Hittites. He went to the Hittites and identified himself with 2 interesting words. He said, I am a foreigner and a visitor, which really says he's moved around so much, he doesn't really belong in any place. He sees himself as a foreigner. After all, he had come from Ur of the Chaldees long, long ago. A visitor, well, it's not my permanent home yet because God hasn't given me this land as he said he would. And so with those kinds of designations, he wanted them to understand that he didn't own any land. He was what we might call a resident alien. And here he is. And he trusted these people to respect him enough to offer assistance. When they speak to him and of him, they raise him to a much higher level than he put himself. I'm a foreigner and a visitor, he said. They said to him, "You are a prince among our people." It said they respected Abraham mightily. They listened to his requests. They thought of how they could assist him. It's all a matter of taking care of this man with his very personal needs. In fact, they offered him the very choicest of their own burial plots. You know, here's where our dead are buried. You're welcome to one of these places. Jesus was buried in a borrowed tomb, but for only 3 days. Abraham needed something much longer than that. He did not want to bury Sarah in a borrowed plot. He needed land that would be his in perpetuity. I suspect he even thought the day will come when I will probably lie at her side. And so he said, we need something more permanent than that. He realized also that allowing her to be buried in a borrowed tomb meant that the Hittites would still own that land. And they could at some time decide they needed that plot and her body would be removed. A frightening prospect. He needed that place where she could rest and where he could later join her. And so we began talking about the need for a burial plot. In the midst of death and in the midst of loss and grief, it seems a little strange to have to think in terms of real estate and purchasing and making all these kinds of arrangements that could have been done before but had not been. Everything has to be put aside to deal with the immediate. Some things are necessary, and they cannot be overlooked very long. And so we move to the second part of our text, where Abraham requests a specific site. You get the distinct feeling that in all of Abraham's moving around and all of his wanderings, he may have been spying out some land. Would that be a possibility someday? Or would that piece over there be useful to me? And so he comes back to the sons of Heth. Abraham stood up, again, changing his bodily posture, and bowed himself to the people of the land, the sons of Heth. And he spoke with them, saying, "If it is your wish that I bury my dead out of my sight, hear me, and meet with Ephron the son of Zohar for me, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he has, which is at the end of his field. Let him give it to me at the full price, as property for a burial place among you." Now Ephron dwelt among the sons of Heth, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the presence of the sons of Heth, all who entered at the gate of the city, saying, "No, my lord, hear me. I give you the field and the cave that's in it. I give it to you in the presence of the sons of my people. I give it to you. Bury your dead." As I said, Abraham perhaps already had a place in mind. No doubt as he moved around, he spotted the cave of Machpelah and thought it would make a good burial place. Caves were often used for that purpose. Jesus was put in a cave and then a stone rolled over the door. When the time arose that he needed the site, this would be the place. Well, that time was now. He even knew the owner of the land. He had done a little checking and says to the sons of Heth, "Would you speak to Ephron the Hittite for me?" In other words, you've already offered your kindness. You've called me a prince. Would you be my character reference as we go to Ephron and make our request? A Hittite. You may remember that Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba, was also a Hittite. The name does appear frequently in the Bible. Abraham asked them to arrange this meeting with Ephron. He knew the cave. He knew it was located at the end of a field. He had indeed searched it out. He knew its location. He knew its size. He knew its owner. And now he asks Ephron to give him the cave. Now, you need to understand in reading this section about bargaining, the words "give me" really mean "sell me." Nobody was expecting this just to be a gift. Abraham didn't expect that. Ephron didn't think of it either. When he says, "I will give you," he means I'm willing to sell it to you. When I was a college student, I had several classes with Carol Ellis. And I remember distinctly Carol telling us one day that He had just come back from holding a meeting down in the rural section of Middle Tennessee. And during the week of the meeting, he stayed in the home of one of the church members there. He said every morning for breakfast, his wife fixed country ham, and it was wonderful. And Carol bragged on the country ham and talked about how good it was. And toward the end of the week, the old farmer said to him, "Brother Ellis, I'm going to let you have one of my country hams." Carol was elated. He came back home and told the folks where he was preaching here in town about that wonderful gift he had been granted. He was given a country ham. He said not long after that, he got a note from the farmer with a bill for the ham. "I'm going to let you have one" means I'm willing to sell you one. And Carol said, "You know, the second half of that ham never tasted as good as the first half." We need to understand in bargaining, what do we mean by the terms? And Abraham understood that too, because he says to the man, "I will offer the full price." He was prepared to pay. What did the man want? But the bargaining goes on, the give and take that's all a part of this kind of arrangement. In the same sentence, Abraham added those words, "at full price." Ephron knew selling the cave without the adjoining land presented a couple of problems. Number one, he knew that if he sold just the cave and it was going to become a burial place, he'd have a hard time convincing anybody else to buy the land that surrounded it, with somebody else's burial site there at the end of it. He also knew that if he didn't sell the land with the cave, he would still have to pay the taxes on the land. So there were good reasons to be sure that we got rid of all of it. And so when Ephron talks back to Abraham, he says to him, "I'll let you have the field and the cave." You put them together. You don't buy one without the other. And so he wanted to sell both of those. "I give you the field and the cave that is in it," he said. It just happened to name both of them, so that Abraham understood what he was buying was the full thing, land and cave. And so they work on this and finally reach their agreement. And we pick up in our reading with verse 12. "Then Abraham bowed himself down before the people of the land." You notice how in every section he's bowing? He bows himself now before the people of the land. "And he spoke to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, saying, 'If you will give it, please hear me. I will give you money for the field. Take it from me, and I will bury my dead there.' And Ephron answered Abraham, saying to him, 'My lord, listen to me. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? So bury your dead.' And Abraham listened to Ephron. And Abraham weighed out the silver for Ephron, which he had named in the hearing of the sons of Heth, 400 shekels of silver, currency of the merchants. And so the field of Ephron, which was in Machpelah, which was before Mamre, the field and the cave which was in it, and all the trees that were in the field, which were within all the surrounding borders, were deeded to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the sons of Heth, before all who went in the gate of his city. And after this, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. So the field and the cave that's in it were deeded to Abraham by the sons of Heth as property for a burial place." Notice again the continuing respect that Abraham shows as he bowed before those with whom he bargained. He bowed before the sons of Heth when he sought their help. He bowed before Ephron when he made his request to purchase the field and the land and the cave. He was the first to mention the money. "I will give you money for the field." And Ephron, the shrewd trader that he was, seemed to say, "Well, you know, if I were willing to sell it, it would be worth 400 pieces of silver, 400 shekels of silver." And then he adds, but what's that between you and me? You know, we care for each other. We're not going to let money separate us. What is that between you and me? Truthfully, the price was exorbitant, far more than that land was worth, but Abraham did not bargain. Coinage was not even in use in those days. You'll notice that it does not say that Abraham counted out the money. He weighed out the shekels of silver. It all was a matter of weight. And he had to be sure that he had that full amount. Later, one of the kings of Israel wanted to build a city for his kingdom. And he purchased a hillside where he was going to build the city of Samaria. And he paid 6,000 shekels for a hill, a mountain. Abraham paid 400 for a cave and a field. Jeremiah tells of buying a parcel of ground about the size of Machpelah, and he paid 17 shekels for it. So you compare other purchases in the Bible with this, well, there's a difference. That account of Omri is found in 1 Kings chapter 16, and the account of Jeremiah is in Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 9. Ephron wanted to make sure that Abraham understood exactly what he was purchasing. And so you'll notice in that identification with it in verse 17, the field of Ephron, which was in Machpelah, which was before Mamre, which is on the east, the field and the cave, which was in it, and all the trees that were in the field, which were within the surrounding borders, were deeded. It's interesting to use the verb deeded because you have the distinct feeling we're talking about a deed. And here are all the details that go in that official document. The name of the place, its physical location, anything that surrounds it. There's a field, and there are all these trees that border it. All of that's a part of the deed. And they were deeded to Abraham. For a man who owned no land, he now owns land. He owns a field. He owns a cave located in that field. He owns the trees that border it. He knows what direction it's in. He knows where it's located. It is the cave of Machpelah near Mamre in Canaan. Go look at your deed sometime. It has some rather specific references in it to the physical location. So the deed was filed, however it was they filed it in those days. The arrangement was made, meeting in the city gates, which is where all business transpired. We remember that from the book of Ruth. This is where the elders of the city gathered, and they approved or disapproved of potential purchases. And as they met here at the gate of the city, this arrangement was clarified between Abraham and Ephron. The deed was agreed upon, the price was paid. The deed was completed then. Abraham could not know for certainty that years later from now, he himself would be buried in that same cave to lie along the side of Sarah. Even after that, Isaac and Rebekah would be buried in the cave of Machpelah. And after them, Jacob and Leah would be buried in the cave of Machpelah. It became what you and I would call today a family burial plot. And there people lay. The cave of Machpelah is still evident today in the country of Israel. The Muslims have built a mosque over that site, but the place is there. And people like to point out that that was the burial site for all of these people. We notice that this passage began, and our text began, with Abraham mourning and weeping. That's normal reaction to grief. But it ends with all the business arrangements being taken care of, the finality of that deed. Nobody can take it away from him now. It's his. He paid not only the full purchase price, he paid a ridiculous purchase price. It became a very valuable piece of property, not only for the amount of money that was spent, but for its use. It was always going to matter to that family because of their ancestors who lay buried there. Just as Abraham dealt with his grief, Isaac will have to deal with his. And in our lesson for next week, we're going to look at the section where Isaac sends for a wife. And Rebekah is chosen, and when she's brought back by Isaac's representative, and Isaac sees her for the first time, the first thing he does is take her, the Bible tells us, into his mother Sarah's tent. Sarah's been dead a long time already. But there was something that moved Isaac. If my mother were here, she'd want to meet you. And so he takes Rebekah to his mother's tent. We'll look at that next week in our lesson. But it simply says that grief is ongoing. It's not isolated with a single person. It's a part of the family. And it will continue for year after year after year. So, what are some lessons that you and I can draw from this study about the death of Sarah? On one side, we have a sense of loss. On the other side, we have a practical side. And both of those have to be dealt with. Even in our sorrow and in our grief, we can never overlook practical matters. I've gone with families to the funeral home to help make arrangements for somebody in their family who's died. And they've asked for me to go along just to have somebody who's kind of objective about the whole thing, to offer some advice or counsel. We're talking about a lot of money nowadays to cover a funeral. And you need to be careful choices you make, not to spend money that's not necessary. But be sure you do things with dignity, to honor the one who's died, and to honor your own family, to make sure you've done the very best that you can. Regretfully, there are people in the industry, the burial industry, who will try to take advantage of some person's grief. You want to deal with a person who's honest, who's Christian, who's above board, who's trustworthy, that they understand your plight and your grief, but they understand your need, and they understand that you have a future that lies ahead, and you need to be able to go into that future carefully. And so even in sorrow and grief, we have to deal with the practical. Even have to recognize that some would take advantage of us in that time, but Abraham may have been taken advantage of in the price that he paid, but he was perfectly willing to do it because that's the way he wanted to treat Sarah. Finally, Ephron fully intended to sell all of that property for his price, but Abraham focused on the important thing. He focused on a burial place for his wife, and that became more important than anything else he dealt with. It's interesting, in these last 2 weeks, we've talked about Abraham's love and care for his son as he takes Isaac, his only son, the son he loved, and presumably to satisfy God, is willing to offer him as a sacrifice. And now we deal with the loss of his wife. After 100 years of marriage, or 100 years or so, he loved her, and he wanted to provide for her with the very best that he could offer. That's the way most of us are. When we get to our time of grief and loss, we want to do the right thing. We want to be sure that we handle things with the dignity that seems appropriate. When Jesus came to that garden in Bethany where Lazarus was buried, he knew full well that all that could be done had been done. Lazarus had been cared for, properly laid to rest, just as Jesus will be properly laid to rest not many days hence. There are good examples in the Scriptures for how we deal with the dead, and we need to remember those examples and follow them wisely and thoughtfully. Let's end with a prayer. Father, we are grateful for today and for the continuation of our study in the book of Genesis. It deals for us with the beginning of life on the earth. It began with the words, "in the beginning." And most of the things that we encounter in our study are either the first or second or maybe the third time something has happened, but we're seeing life unfold and seeing people learn how to deal with life itself. That's why the book is such a good study for us, because it reminds us of those things that we have to know about those things we have to do. And so as we've talked about Abraham's care for burying Sarah, it wasn't let's just get her out of the way. It's how can I handle her with the dignity that she deserves and make an appropriate burial place where future generations will know and honor her in that place. We ask that you let us be so thoughtful, so earnest, and so trustworthy in our dealings with one another. We're grateful for our class, for the opportunity to spend some time in this reflection, and pray that you would bless those as they listen later today. In Christ's name, amen.